Welcome to Plain Talk. Happy to be with you. Before the show, we were discussing the sartorial excellence of our new superintendent, Levi Bachmeier, who's joining us.
Did you say sutorial?
Sartorial, as in dress, fashion.
Wow, there's a lot of people who just left the podcast because they have to run to a dictionary.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry. Maybe they'll learn something, which is an important way, a very good segue into our new top education official for the state of North Dakota, Levi Bachmeier, whose suit looks sharp and pressed even after a long day of meetings, which is just great for him. I don't even own an iron. I try to avoid buying clothing that requires me to iron it. That's where I'm at. But Levi looking good, and now our superintendent of public instruction. Congratulations.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Chad. I too am not an ironer. I learned early on in the then Governor Burgum's campaign, when you're on the road, buy the steamer, man. It makes life a lot easier, and you don't have to learn the delicate skill of ironing.
So, Levi, yesterday was a big day for you. Obviously, the governor appointed you to fulfill the term of Kirsten Baszler if the government ever opens and Kirsten ever actually goes to Washington and gets sworn in. So you're sort of in a holding period right now, waiting for the government to open up. But I've got some bad news for you, Levi. I have been reading stuff on the internet, and people are only saying really, really good things about you. So I think it's only downhill from here. But in all seriousness,
That's not true, by the way. I read a Reddit thread that was not
okay.
That was not complimentary. So
Yes, well, we better send that to him. Don't want him to get too confident. But I think one of the things that's interesting, it doesn't matter what I'm reading from Democrats, Republicans, independent teachers, administrators. They've all expressed an appreciation of when they work with you, you work with them very well. One of the things I love about North Dakota education is all the stakeholders can come together and have a conversation, and we haven't fallen into sort of that the pitfalls of national education partisanship. How do you maintain that sort of momentum in the state where North Dakota, I mean, there's been some times, but how do we continue that trajectory of working together to make sure public education continues to be nonpartisan?
Yeah, it's a great question, Chad. And I think one of the most important parts of the role is you're sort of the chief trust builder. And one of the most important parts of building trust is being honest about reality. But also, being a champion, and celebrating good things when they happen. So I'm honored to have the trust of Governor Armstrong, and hope to build that same trust with every voter and student and teacher in North Dakota. But I think your question is a good one, and it's probably one of the most fundamental of where do we go from here? How do we go from a relatively high-performing state nationally when you look at the NAEP to the best, which I think we can be. And I think it really just comes from all of us. But in this role, I have a responsibility to ensure that the focus is on what's best for students. And I think if everybody can continue to come to the table and keep that focus and put perhaps their own specific interests second to doing what's best for kids, I think that's what's made it work here for as long as it has. I think it's a huge part of the success that we have enjoyed in North Dakota for a long time. And when we keep kids at the forefront of the decisions that we're making, that we're involving and empowering parents, that we're supporting and challenging teachers, I think good things will happen.
I want to ask a couple of logistical things. I mean, first, as Chad alluded to, your predecessor has not been appointed to her federal position yet, which is the reason she's vacating the office you've been appointed to. So tell us a little bit about that timeline. And also, you're currently a sitting member of the State Board of Higher Education. What happens with that situation? Are you resigning your seat there, I'm assuming?
Yeah, I'll start maybe with that one first. I submitted a resignation letter to the governor right after the press conference, which
That's kind of
stated
funny. He appoints you, and then you immediately resign another position that he appointed you to.
right. And I'm grateful. It was the rumor, that Assistant Secretary Baszler may be, getting involved in this role, but the governor and I had a lot of great talks about how do we better integrate K-12 and higher ed, which I think is only more important with each passing day. So I will be stepping down from that. It is effective upon assuming my new position. So I intend to be at the State Board of Higher Ed meeting next week, and will continue to serve in my current roles for as long as the transition lasts. The other two boards that I'm on, the state superintendent has a statutorily defined seat, so it'll mean that a new citizen member will be able to join, which I think is great. So that's the logistics on the boards, and when it comes to timeline, I'm just viewing this with gratitude and seeing it as an opportunity to learn as much as I can about the new role before officially jumping in, and making sure that I do an honorable job of transitioning out of my current role. I'm a graduate of West Fargo schools. I care a lot about this community, and I want to make sure that they remain successful when it comes to the finance operations world that I live in. So having some time to train and support an intern business manager is fine by me. So I'm just gonna learn the new role and support the my current position, West Fargo schools. And when it happens, and I'll be excited to jump in and get to work.
Levi, there's been lots of conversations about your background working for Burgum for several years as a policy advisor, now in West Fargo as a business manager. But one thing that I haven't heard you talk a lot about was the 2 years you spent down in South Dakota on the reservations as a teacher and a principal. Can you talk a little bit about those few years and what you learned in a really high poverty, a high needs school, and what you learned from that experience that you're going to bring into this job? Because I do think it's an important part of understanding all students.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for the question, Chad. I will, disclaimer before I begin. I also hold a degree in education. I'm a traditionally trained teacher, and I went through the alternative certification. So I know some people have some very strong feelings about Teach for America for a lot of different reasons, but I think it'll actually make me better in my new role, having seen the strengths and weaknesses of both of those approaches. But really, the premise of Teach for America is to take mostly recent college grads, high performing students who might otherwise be going to graduate school, and put them in a domestic Peace Corps, serving some of the poorest communities in our country. And I was really drawn to that opportunity when I graduated. I was a traditionally trained teacher. Part of me felt drawn to try to go teach at West Fargo or another North Dakota school district right away. But I think my upbringing and just interest in service really sort of made me gravitate to exploring that opportunity. Um, and I've applied and got accepted, and I got placed on the Pine Ridge Nation, which is, down in Southwest South Dakota. I taught high school social studies to the whole. It's a small district, so if people are like, this guy doesn't understand rural education because he works in West Fargo, I taught at a very, very small school. I was the social studies department. And it was just an incredible experience to not only learn and grow as a teacher, but really I'd had such limited exposure to the beauties and challenges of our tribal communities. And that was an incredible learning experience. I'll be the first to say that I probably learned more from my kids than they learned from me, but I worked really hard to do as much as I could, both in the classroom and as a coach. And it was a really powerful experience. I know some people are probably going to look at my resume and say, that guy only taught for 2 years. What does he know about what it means to be in the classroom? I packed a lot into those 2 years, and I have seen um, the incredible and the good, the bad, and the ugly of what it means to work in schools in America. Objectively, I believe one of the poorest counties in the United States of America. But to not just focus on that, to focus on the strengths and the beauty of the community and the hiking and the culture and all of those things. And it was a privilege to learn and live down there, and it's something that I intend to draw from every day in the new role.
Let's talk a little bit about education outcomes. I think we're still in a post-pandemic swoon. We saw a big drop off in some achievement scores, some test scores. after the pandemic, and even understanding the test scores on anything. You mentioned, the NAEP scores specifically, us being, better than a lot of states, but be that as it may, looking at the scores, they're not anything that I think we can. And this may sound harsh. I'm not sure they're anything we can really be proud of. We could be doing a lot better than we are. So talk about that. I mean, first of all, do you agree with that assessment? And second of all, how do we advance? How do we improve?
Sure, Rob. I think one of the goals that I have is everything seems to be nationalizing when it comes to politics, which means it becomes tribal, and it means that you have to fall in camp A or B. And I just really want to reject the premise that our schools are failing. But I equally want to reject the premise that our schools are perfect and that we don't have to
And I,
get
and I want
better.
to be clear. I was not saying that they're
Yeah, yeah,
failing,
no,
but when
no,
I
and I'm
when you're where you're looking at like
yep.
you know you know 40-50% of students testing proficient in reading or mathematics, even if that's better than a lot of other states, that's nothing to be satisfied with.
And I agree. And I just commenting more generally, I think where we're at, it's easy to fall into this. I'm either pro or I'm against, and I know in politics, the middle of the road's a dangerous place to be, but I think that's the right one here. We have to do better. We can do better. Um, we've got the teachers to do it. I think we have the community support. We have the parents. We have the infrastructure to do it. So I think you're right. We shouldn't look at the NAEP scores and see that only one state is statistically higher than us in math and say, hey, that's good enough. I think we say we weathered the pandemic better than almost every other state in the country when it comes to performance. But we can't just say, oh, well, now that we're ranked higher, that's good enough. And so we got to keep improving. I do think it's important. I've learned a lot about state assessments in the last couple weeks, and I think it's important for people to know when we talk about proficiency in North Dakota on these tests. This proficiency isn't a bar that's set by some test maker in Texas or Washington or anywhere else. These bars are set by North Dakota teachers, and I think it's also worth noting that we have really high expectations. And so, we need to engage kids with high expectations to increase that proficiency rate. I mean, that's just an obligation that we have. But I think it's also important to note that if these teachers who came from all corners of the state and just had lower expectations, the same results, the same answers on those tests would suggest to people that we're doing a lot better. So I think it's important that we put that in context. I think these tests have an incredibly important purpose. I think they're just as much of a comparative analysis as they are a direct performance indicator. But all of that's to say, and to go back to your point that I agree with you, we have to do better. We have an obligation to these kids, and not just on standardized tests that AI will already probably is and will in the future be able to be better at than they will. But we need to have knowledge, we need to have skills, and we need to have mindsets developed and supported in these students so they can contribute in the real world.
Yeah, Levi, I love that answer about, you can love public schools and think public schools are doing a great job while still admitting they're not, public schools are not pitching a perfect game, right? If you love something, you put time in it, and you're willing to be critical of things that need to get better. And I think that a lot of the time, you're right, people do fall into that camp. Either they're failing completely or they can't do anything wrong. So I think your approach is exactly right. I want to ask you about, you shared a podium with Governor Armstrong, and when he's talking about education, there's one issue that continuously comes up, and that's the cell phone ban. You're obviously living this firsthand in West Fargo, both you and your wife, who I believe is a principal in West Fargo. And tell us how it's working in West Fargo. Were you supportive? Were you concerned about it? Sort of what was your opinion going in, and what's your opinion now that it's been implemented for several months?
So my wife and I have two young daughters. Our eldest isn't yet two, and technology frankly terrifies me when it comes to raising two girls in today's world. And maybe we can have a separate debate on, I think you guys had a podcast on Pat Trainer's comments, and we probably don't have time to get super deep into all of that. But I would say, supportive, a little concerned about what that would look like at the high school level when kids could protest by going out to their cars and just leaving campus. which would probably undermine our goal of having them talk to each other. But I think students have responded with the permission structure to talk to each other again in a really positive way. I said this yesterday. I think one of the most powerful, stories that I've heard from the school buildings in West Fargo anyway came from an assistant principal who nearly had tears in her eyes when we were talking about this, and she said the lunchrooms are loud again. And um, what a just a great moment to capture not only, what we expect from our schools is not only academic performance, but helping students build lifelong friends and build social skills and communication skills and all of these things that they're going to need in the real world. And if you're staring down at your phone, you're not really doing that. So I was pretty scared about what it might mean. One of my roles as business manager is to support our food service director. She was terrified. Are we gonna have to lay off high school food service staff because kids just leave to use their phones? But I think kids are, especially high school students, are probably a little smarter than we give them credit for. And by creating the permission structure and knowing that there aren't other students who are on their phones all the time, it makes it easier for them to engage with the people around them. So I thank Governor Armstrong for his leadership. I would say, talking to school leaders across our big district, everyone sort of agrees it's going, a lot better than I think people expected. No one wanted to only be dealing with phone discipline issues and not focusing on instruction. But while there's always a couple of those, it really, um, I think it's been successful and has been doing what the bill intended to accomplish.
Yeah. I will refrain from turning this into a debate. But I don't know. I think the kids were talking before. They're just now talking in a way that's more recognizable to the old people. So I don't know. The proof will be in
How
the pudding.
dare you call Levi old?
Yeah. Well, he's significantly younger than I am. I'll put it that way. And a heck of a lot younger than you are, Chad. Um, I don't know. I think we're all patting ourselves on the back for doing something that the results aren't in yet. So let's pump the brakes. We'll find out. Let's talk politics a little bit though, Levi, because this is an elected position you're in now. And because you're appointed, even though Kirsten Baszler was just elected to a new term last year, because you're appointed, you're going to have to appear on the next general election ballot. Kirsten always sought the Republican endorsement. You're a Republican. You've served as a district chair in the Republican Party, so I'm assuming you would take, even though this office is officially nonpartisan, traditionally the candidates have sought party endorsements. Kirsten Baszler had kind of a fraught relationship with the party. She was actually rejected the endorsement at the last state convention. So what does that path look like to you? Now, I should point out, Kirsten went on to win handily in the primary and the general election. She had no problems at all getting reelected. But what does that path look like for you? Speak about that. This will really be the first time, right? First time you'll ever be on the ballot?
It will. I'm going to be honest, Rob, I haven't spent a second thinking about the politics of this. I've been really focused on just thinking through how do I do the job well and hope that if that's done well, the politics will take care of itself. But it's a fair question. I won't be seeking, the Democratic convention support. And I'm going to have to think really hard about what I do as a Republican when it comes to running for a nonpartisan seat. I found a digital book from the state library that sort of traced the history of the Department of Public Instruction from its inception as Dakota Territory through the early 1930s. The author was the state superintendent at the time. It was effectively a report to the legislature, and she called an era shortly before the rise of the nonpartisan league in the late teens, the golden era of the department, and characterized it as stable and nonpartisan. And so I think, with Kirsten moving on to Washington, I think it's important to people to know, my political beliefs. I'm a Republican. I'm a conservative. But when it comes to how do I, approach this question as someone who's seeking an officially nonpartisan position. I'm going to think about that because I think one of the big issues we were talking about a little bit earlier in terms of tribalism is one of the surest ways to erode trust in public schools is if parents think that schools are political one way or the other. And I take that really seriously. So intend to ensure that I'm not naive enough to assume that when you're dealing with people's most precious resources, their kids and their tax dollars that are taken from them, that this is an inherently political job. But I'm going to work really hard to make sure that it's not partisan, and that's going to influence how I approach, your question about the conventions.
Levi, you mentioned earlier having two young children, very young children, a wife who's an education leader herself. Um, the forum reported that the family's not moving to Bismarck, although I did recognize at your press conference how many times you said you were happy to be in Bismarck, and we're happy to have you in Bismarck as a Bismarckian. That this is going to be tough, right? I mean, there's no doubt when you're thinking about taking this appointment and you and Rachel had the conversations, your family was a big part of this conversation. Can you talk a little bit about the mechanics of how you're going to do this job, which is based in the state capital, your family's in West Fargo, and how do you balance those things? Because that and wanting to be out in schools a lot as well. And so maybe that makes it easier because you're going to be traveling anyway. So can you just talk a little bit about your thought process there and how you're going to handle that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you sort of answered the question for me, Chad. I think the only way to do this well is to get in the truck. I'm not going to be able to visit all 168 school districts in a year, but one of the things that I learned working for Governor Burgum is people expect that you go to them and hear about what's working well and what's not. And so I'll be on the road a lot. So knowing that that's how I want to approach the work, not only leading the team in Bismarck in the state capital, I'm a big believer of eye to eye and elbow to elbow, teamwork. So I'm going to be in Bismarck doing that work, but I'm also going to be visiting schools a lot. And so sort of through that lens, it was what's best for our family. One with two young kids, we don't have any family, any supports in Bismarck. My parents are an incredible support for us right now, having two big jobs. It's really important that our kids grow up around family, is one piece. And then, the second thing is I only hope to love this job as much as my wife loves hers. And as someone who's, a husband and a dad first and a worker second, I would never ask her to give up her dream to support mine. And she lived and taught at West Fargo High School when I worked in the governor's office, and I did a lot of driving. And so that's what it's going to entail. It's going to entail a lot of driving, but keeping the focus on what's best for our family while also ensuring that I do the job that our students deserve.
Uh, your predecessor, I guess not quite predecessor yet, but when she becomes your predecessor, uh, she is going to be going to a Washington D.C. where the focus is on really eliminating a lot of the federal administration of education in our state, and that's one thing that Kirsten Baszler has said that she wants to help facilitate that and flow some of that policy back to the states. What is your attitude about that? How do you feel about that as someone who's now going to be, the standing, at the top of North Dakota's public education system?
Well, I mean, as someone who's sort of philosophically conservative, I think the general direction to empower the states is a great one. I did a fellowship at the Department of Education. I've been there. I think this conversation over the Department of Ed is sort of a political football that doesn't actually matter for kids. So I haven't spent a ton of time thinking about it because whether there's X or Y or Z number of employees at US Ed, um, I, I struggle to see how that's going to have a material impact on our students. So I think it has an outsized political focus, but when it comes to the work that we're going to do here in North Dakota, I think the more empowerment that the states can have, the better. Those resources, particularly for our low income and disabled students, are important. And hope that those continue to flow without delay. But I'm really not too worried about it. whether there's a Department of Education, I mean, there's going to be one. Congress is not going to close it. So whatever it looks like, I'm not going to lose too much sleep over, the number of FTEs that are living in Washington, at the expense of focusing on things that I think will really move the needle for kids. And that's what's going on in our classrooms.
Levi, one of the things you talked about this at the press conference yesterday, but when you were going through the interview process, when the governor made this appointment, were there any things that he said, Levi, as superintendent, you have to do this, or you have to help me accomplish this goal? Again, I know you sort of alluded to this at the press conference, and Kelly did as well, but can you respond? Were there any strings attached policy-wise when the governor appointed you to this job?
No, none whatsoever. We had a chance to chat a little bit beforehand about, what are some things that we can work on, and Kelly is an incredibly passionate and intelligent governor, and I think the expectation is that we have the debate if we don't, agree. So I can learn where he's coming from, and he can challenge me, and I can do the same with him. And I think that's what makes good policy. So no strings attached, no litmus test, no, support this veto. I was grateful. I was completely aligned with how he approached a lot of the ed policy conversations. I don't think choice is inherently a 4-letter word. I think it will be really interesting to see what happens with these charter schools. They play by the same rules. And so can we learn some interesting things that can help all of our public schools? So I look forward to working with the governor's office. They have an incredibly important role in the conversations about education. Obviously, as the former policy director, I know the what that office does and how deeply it cares about the state. So looking forward to the debates. Kelly's an attorney, so I'm gonna have to sharpen up my debate skills, but I think that's only gonna make us better. And I really appreciate, Kelly said at the press conference yesterday that he knows that I'll have a good sense on how does the theoretical policy debate actually get implemented in the classroom. And I think that that's foundationally important. And I intend to be talking to a lot of people who are working in schools because it'll be different for me. I have a decent pulse right now, but I'm not in the classroom either. And I won't assume that. So I think it's working with the practitioners to understand, what might work and what might not work, but also challenging them to think differently. And back to Rob's earlier point, we have to continue to improve, and nobody wants the definition of insanity, which is just doing the same thing over and over again. So if we can really focus on the practices and the approaches that move the needle, and we have a realistic understanding of how those will actually play out in the classroom, I'm pretty optimistic that we can do some great things for kids.
Levi, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Levi.